May 4th, 2026. And right now, as you're watching this, the most explosive standoff in the Strait of Hormuz since the Iran-Iraq tanker wars of the 1980s is not just threatening, it has officially gone hot. Iran fired missiles at a U.S. Navy warship today, and the United States military responded hard. So let's break down exactly what happened, what's real, what's Iranian propaganda, and why this moment, today, May 4th, could be the tipping point that changes the entire trajectory of this conflict. Let me set the scene for you, because this didn't come out of nowhere. It goes back to February 28th, 2026, the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under an operation called Epic Fury. Those strikes targeted military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership. And they resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Iran responded with a wave of missile barrages, proxy attacks across the region, and within days, they did the one thing they always said they would do, but that nobody truly believed they'd actually follow through on. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic through the strait has been largely blocked since February 28, 2026, with the IRGC issuing warnings forbidding passage, boarding and attacking merchant ships, and laying sea mines in the waterway. Let that sink in for a second. The choke point responsible for roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil, gone, locked. Iran put a padlock on the world's gas tank. Now fast forward to last night, Sunday, May 3rd. President Trump took to social media and dropped the announcement that had the entire Middle East holding its breath. He called it Project Freedom. He said the United States would begin guiding stranded ships out of the Strait of Hormuz starting Monday, today, and that any interference would, quote, have to be dealt with forcefully. Not suggested, not requested, dealt with forcefully. That language was deliberate, and Iran heard it loud and clear. U.S. Central Command confirmed that Project Freedom would kick off on May 4th, with a mission to restore freedom of navigation for commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a quarter of the die. World's oil trade at sea, along with significant volumes of fuel and fertilizer products. And backing that mission up, not a couple of ships and a prayer, CENTCOM confirmed the force package includes more than 100 aircraft, several guided missile destroyers, and 15,000 troops. 2 full carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush, positioned together in the Arabian Sea for the first time since this conflict began. That is historic. That is the most concentrated American naval firepower in this region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So here's where things get explosive. Iran's response to Project Freedom came fast, and it came with missiles. Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that 2 missiles were fired at a U.S. Navy vessel after it attempted to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, with Fars claiming the vessel was targeted after it ignored a warning from the naval forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Fars even went further, claiming the warship was hit, that it was unable to continue its course and was forced to retreat and flee. That's the headline they blasted out to the world. Iranian state media ran with it, outlets picked it up, and for about 45 minutes, social media absolutely lost its mind. But here's where we separate the facts from the theater. CENTCOM dropped a statement that was short, sharp, and surgical. No U.S. Navy ships have been struck. U.S. forces are supporting Project Freedom and enforcing the naval blockade on Iranian ports. Full stop. No warship damaged, no retreat, no mission abort. Meanwhile, FA-18 Super Hornets were already lifting off the flight deck of the Abraham Lincoln before the Iranian propaganda machine had even finished its first press release. Now, I want to be clear about something, because some people are going to look at the CENTCOM denial and say, well, they'd say that regardless. Fair point. But here's what you need to understand about Iran's track record. This is not the first time. Back on March 1st, Iran claimed its ballistic missiles had struck the USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class carrier. CENTCOM called it a flat-out lie, stating the missile's launch didn't even come close. This is a pattern. Iran fires, misses, then tells its own people they scored a kill. It's not incompetence. It's a calculated psychological operation designed to keep the population in line, signal strength to allies and proxies, and convince European audiences that the Americans are losing. We're going to get into exactly why they do this in a moment. But first, let me tell you what Iran actually did do today that is completely real, completely confirmed, and completely terrifying for the global economy. The U.S. military confirmed that Iran launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small fast attack boats at U.S. Navy ships and commercial vessels. 6 small Iranian boats were destroyed. The Iranian boats were engaged by U.S. Apache and SH-60 Seahawk helicopters. And on top of that, the UAE condemned what it called an Iranian terrorist attack that targeted a tanker belonging to the state-owned Abu Dhabi National Oil Company ADNOC, as it attempted to pass through the strait. So while Iran was busy making up a story about hitting a U.S. frigate, they were simultaneously attacking a civilian energy tanker belonging to one of America's closest Gulf partners. That's not an accident. That's a message. And it tells you everything about how desperate and reckless Tehran is becoming right now. The question I want you sitting with before we get into the tactical picture, what are they actually trying to achieve? Because firing missiles at a U.S. warship and missing, then lying about it, while simultaneously attacking UAE tankers, is not a winning military strategy. It's something else entirely. And understanding what it is will explain every move Iran makes from here. So let's answer that question I left you with. Why does Iran fire missiles, miss, and then tell the world they scored a direct hit? Why does a nation with real military capability, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, sea mines, hundreds of fast attack boats, why does it resort to flat-out fabrication every single time it engages the U.S. Navy? The answer has nothing to do with the U.S. military. It has everything to do with the streets of Tehran. Think about what's been happening inside Iran since February 28th. The U.S.-Israeli strikes that launched Operation Epic Fury killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who held the entire theocratic structure together for over 3 decades. The regime that replaced him is operating on borrowed time, borrowed legitimacy, and borrowed credibility. When you've lost your supreme leader to a foreign airstrike, you have 2 choices. You either negotiate from a position of weakness, or you perform strength so aggressively that your own population forgets to ask uncomfortable questions. Iran chose option 2, and their primary instrument for that performance is Fars News Agency, the IRGC's media arm, and it went into full overdrive today. Over the past few months, Iran has repeatedly claimed to have struck several U.S. naval ships operating in the region, including the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier back in early March. Each time, CENTCOM issued flat denials. Each time, Iranian state media kept the story running for days on domestic channels. Because here's the thing, the average person on the streets of Tehran doesn't have access to CENTCOM's press releases. They're watching state television, reading Fars News, and listening to IRGC-affiliated commentary telling them their military is winning. It's a closed information loop, and the regime is very, very good at exploiting it. But the propaganda isn't only pointed inward. There's a second audience, and that's Europe. Specifically, there are governments in London, Paris, and Berlin that have been quietly uncomfortable with the U.S. approach to this conflict from day one. Iran knows that if it can create enough narrative ambiguity, if it can make European audiences believe the Americans are sustaining casualties, taking hits, bleeding in the strait, then political pressure builds on Washington from its own allies to negotiate, pull back, or at minimum soften the blockade. It's psychological warfare aimed at fracturing the Western coalition, and today's false missile strike claim was textbook execution of that strategy. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because while Iran was running its propaganda operation this morning, the actual military reality playing out in the Strait told a completely different story. And I spent time going through reports from the War Zone, Stars and Stripes, and Long War Journal today to put this picture together for you. As of May 3rd, 2 carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush, are positioned together in the Arabian Sea, providing CENTCOM with double the firepower for either enforcement or, should combat operations resume, follow-on strikes against Iran. That is not a defensive posture. That is a statement. You don't park 2 nuclear-powered carrier strike groups in someone's backyard because you're worried about a 30-day IRGC ultimatum. The Abraham Lincoln's strike group includes guided missile destroyers, cruisers, support vessels, and embarked aircraft. FA-18E Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, E-2 Hawkeyes, MH-60 helicopters, and F-35C Lightning IIs. Now, let me break down why this specific combination of aircraft matters enormously in the context of what happened today. Because when Iran launched those missiles and drones, they weren't just entering a combat zone. They were entering one of the most sophisticated integrated kill chains ever assembled in the history of naval warfare. Let's start with the EA-18G Growler. I want you to remember this aircraft's name. The Growler is the electronic warfare version of the Super Hornet. Its entire job is to go up into the electromagnetic spectrum and dominate it, jamming enemy radar systems, spoofing missile guidance, locating and geolocating every radar that turns on within range. The second Iran activated, targeting radar for those cruise missiles or ballistic systems today, an EA-18G Growler was almost certainly already in the sky, cataloging the emission, building a targeting solution, and feeding that data back into the kill chain. That's not speculation, that's doctrine, that's exactly what that aircraft was designed to do. Now layer on top of that, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye. This is the Navy's airborne early warning aircraft, a essentially a flying radar station with a massive rotodome on top that can push radar coverage out to more than 400 miles. U.S. warships have previously avoided the strait itself, with Navy officials describing it as an Iranian kill box filled with anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and mines. The E-2D is specifically what lets the U.S. Navy counter that threat environment, because it sees threats forming before they fully materialize. By the time an Iranian missile clears the ridgeline near Jask, the E-2D has already been tracking the launch sequence for minutes. And then there's the Aegis combat system on the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. This is the network that ties everything together, the brain of the naval air defense. It can simultaneously track over 100 targets, correlate data from multiple sensors across multiple platforms, and compute intercept solutions in real time. The SM-2 and SM-6 missiles it fires are not short-range last-ditch weapons. SM-6 in particular has a range exceeding 130 nautical miles and can intercept ballistic missiles in their terminal phase. So when Iran fires a salvo, their preferred method, trying to overwhelm defenses from multiple vectors, the Aegis system doesn't see chaos. It sees a math problem, and it solves it. This is precisely what CENTCOM's Admiral Brad Cooper was describing when he said the U.S. has a much broader defensive package than simple one-on-one escort. We have multiple layers that include ships, helicopters, aircraft, airborne early warning, electronic warfare, Cooper told reporters today. We have a much broader defensive package than we would have ever if you're just escorting. Multiple layers, each one independent, each one lethal. You have to defeat all of them simultaneously to get through, and Iran couldn't do it today. And speaking of what Iran actually threw at U.S. and coalition forces today, let's be precise. Iran launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small fast attack boats at U.S. Navy ships and commercial vessels being supported by the military. 6 Iranian fast attack boats were destroyed, engaged by U.S. Army Apache helicopters and Navy SH-60 Seahawk helicopters. Now think about that for a second. The IRGC sent fast attack boats. Small, fast, aggressive, designed for harassment and swarm tactics in confined waters, and they got met by Apache gunships, AH-64. Apaches, the same helicopter that has been a decisive weapon system from the Gulf War through Afghanistan. The IRGC sent speedboats. The U.S. sent Apaches. That's not a fair fight. That's a very expensive lesson in the difference between harassment tactics and actual combat power. Former British Royal Navy Commander Tom Sharp pointed out that Iran's strategy is to keep the drumbeat ticking over, maintaining enough harassment pressure that it deters commercial shipping from running the gauntlet, while signaling to the world that Iran still controls the strait. And that's the key insight here. Iran doesn't need to sink a U.S. destroyer to win the information battle. They just need to create enough doubt in shipping company boardrooms, in European foreign ministries, in financial markets, that Project Freedom feels too risky to participate in. That's their actual objective. Not military victory, narrative victory, but today that narrative got complicated because 2 things happened that Iran absolutely did not want the world to see. And we'll get into exactly what those 2 things were and what they mean for the next 30 days of this conflict. So I told you 2 things happened today that Iran absolutely did not want the world to see. Let's get into them right now. Because these 2 developments, buried under the noise of the missile claims and the propaganda cycle, are actually the most strategically significant things that occurred in the Strait of Hormuz on May 4th, 2026. And once you understand what they are, you'll understand why Tehran's position just got significantly weaker, not stronger. The first thing Iran didn't want the world to see: 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz today. That's it. That's the headline that cuts through everything else. 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels have successfully passed through the Strait of Hormuz, with U.S. Central Command stating that American forces are actively assisting efforts to restore transit for commercial shipping. Now, Iran's IRGC immediately came out and denied this happened. They called it baseless and outright lies. The IRGC said no commercial vessels or oil tankers had transited the strategic waterway in recent hours, rejecting statements by U.S. officials, according to a statement carried by Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency. Think about the significance of this denial for a moment. Iran fired missiles today. Iran launched drones today. Iran sent fast attack boats today that got blown out of the water by Apache helicopters. And after all of that, after everything they threw at Project Freedom on day 1, 2 Americans, merchant ships, still made it through. And Iran's response was to pretend it never happened. Because if their own people, if Europe, if the global shipping industry finds out that the Americans walked ships through the strait on the very first day of the mission, despite Iranian missiles, despite drones, despite fast attack boats, then Iran's entire narrative of dominance and control collapses. The shipping industry remains to be convinced the vital oil route is safe to use, with little sign of progress toward a negotiated resolution. Iran needs that doubt to persist. 2 ships making it through on day 1 is the worst possible advertisement for Iranian deterrence. The second thing Iran didn't want you to see, and this one is particularly revealing about how reckless and undisciplined the IRGC has become under pressure, the UAE condemned what it called an Iranian terrorist attack that targeted a tanker belonging to the state-owned Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, as it tried to pass through the Strait of Hormuz with no injuries reported. Let me be very clear about what just happened here. Iran attacked an ADNOC tanker. That is a state-owned energy company belonging to the United Arab Emirates, a Gulf Arab nation, a country that has historically tried to maintain at least a working relationship with Tehran, a country that is not Israel, not the United States, not a declared enemy. Iran struck their ship with drones. On the same day, they were already firing at the U.S. Navy. That is not the behavior of a regime executing a disciplined strategic plan. That is the behavior of a regime lashing out indiscriminately under pressure, hitting anyone and anything that moves through waters. It claims to control, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. And those consequences matter. The UAE is a significant regional power with deep economic ties to both East and West. Attacking an ADNOC tanker doesn't just antagonize Abu Dhabi, it signals to every Gulf state watching this conflict that Iran's so-called friends policy in the Strait is worthless. Because if you're flying the wrong flag on the wrong day, you're getting hit regardless. Now let's talk about what all of this is doing to the global economy. Because this is where the stakes move beyond military hardware and geopolitical chess and start affecting real people in real ways. U.S. gas prices skyrocketed from an average of $2.98 a gallon before the war started to $4.46 a gallon on Monday, according to AOA, with analysts warning prices could hit $5 a gallon if the situation isn't resolved soon. That's a nearly 50% increase at the pump in a matter of weeks. And it tracks exactly with what's happened to global oil markets since the Strait effectively closed on February 28th. Iran has blocked nearly all shipping into and out of the Gulf apart from its own since the start of the war, sending oil prices soaring by 50% or more. Until the crisis began, approximately 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through the Strait of Hormuz, around 20 million barrels of oil per day. And it's not just oil. The Persian Gulf region accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and around 20 to 30% of ammonia exports, meaning up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the strait. So when people talk about the Strait of Hormuz as a critical choke point, they're not just talking about your gas price. They're talking about the cost of food, the cost of farming, supply chains that touch every industry on the planet. This is why Project Freedom isn't just a military operation. It's an economic rescue mission with a 15,000-person armed escort. Now let's look at the actual mechanics of what Project Freedom is doing on the water today. Because CENTCOM's Admiral Brad Cooper was very specific in his press briefing, and what he described is not a traditional convoy escort. Cooper said the U.S. has cleared a one-way path through the strait meant to allow commercial vessels that have been held hostage in the Persian Gulf for weeks to exit safely. And he was explicit that this isn't one-on-one escort work. The entire defensive architecture, destroyers, helicopters, over 100 aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, unmanned systems, is layered across the strait's approaches to create a protected corridor. You're not putting a single ship next to a tanker and hoping for the best. You're building a moving bubble of lethal air and sea power that any Iranian fast attack boat or missile battery has to think very hard about engaging. The rules of engagement for U.S. forces in the region have also changed to allow strikes on immediate threats against ships crossing the strait, including IRGC fast attack boats or Iranian missile batteries. Read that again. Changed rules of engagement. That means U.S. Navy and Air Force assets operating in support of Project Freedom now have authority to strike Iranian coastal missile systems preemptively if those systems represent an immediate threat to transiting vessels. That is a fundamentally different posture than what existed 2 months ago when U.S. warships were deliberately staying out of the strait entirely. Navy officials had previously described the strait as an Iranian kill box filled with anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and mines. Today, the U.S. military walked into the kill box, blew up 6 Iranian boats, and escorted 2 merchant ships out the other side. And there's one more thing I want you to understand about today's events that almost nobody is talking about: the USS Michaels. Murphy and USS Frank E. Peterson had already demonstrated this exact playbook back on April 11th. The USS Michael Murphy deliberately turned on its automatic identification system as it and another destroyer transited the strait, breaking the typical protocol of Navy ships sailing with their AIS off. Military maritime historian Salvatore Mercoliano noted, "You just don't throw AIS on by accident on a Navy ship. This is purposeful. They wanted to demonstrate that they have sailed through. That April transit was a dress rehearsal, a signal, a proof of concept." May 4th, 2026 is the full performance. So here's where we stand tonight. Iran launched missiles. They missed. They launched drones. They got shot down. They sent fast attack boats. 6 of them are at the bottom of the strait. 2 American merchant ships made it through. An ADNOC tanker was attacked, further isolating Iran diplomatically from Gulf. Partners it needs. Oil hit $4.46 a gallon and climbing. And the USS Abraham Lincoln is still launching aircraft right now as you watch this. The question that keeps me up at night, and it should keep you up too, is what does Iran do next? Because they've just had their first real test of Project Freedom and they failed to stop it. So do they escalate? Do they go bigger? Do they activate something they've been holding in reserve? The answer to that question is going to define the next 30 days of this conflict. And based on everything I've researched across CENTCOM statements, ISW reporting, and open source intelligence today, the picture is more dangerous than most people realize. All right, let's talk about what happens next. Because everything we've covered so far, the missile launches, the propaganda, the Apache strikes, the 2 merchant ships making it through, all of that is prologue. The real question, the one that energy markets, Pentagon war planners, and Gulf state leaders are all wrestling with right now on the evening of May 4th, 2026, is simple. Where does this go from here? And I want to give you an honest, research-backed answer. Not speculation, not doom-scrolling hysteria, but a genuine strategic assessment of the next 30 days based on what we actually know today. Let's start with Iran's options. Because despite everything that went wrong for Tehran today, they are not out of moves. Not even close. The IRGC has been fighting asymmetric warfare doctrine for 4 decades. They wrote the playbook on using inferior conventional forces to impose disproportionate costs on superior enemies. And right now, they have 3 distinct escalation paths available to them. And understanding each one tells you exactly how dangerous the next month could become. Option 1, intensify the swarm. The IRGC is understood to have hundreds of fast attack craft armed with surface-to-surface missiles, as well as many more smaller speedboats, and even jet skis that can be hidden in garages close to the water. Today's 6 destroyed boats are a rounding error against that inventory. Iran could dramatically increase the frequency and density of fast attack swarm operations, not necessarily to sink a U.S. destroyer, but to make the protected corridor so chaotic and unpredictable that commercial shipping companies refuse to send their vessels through regardless of U.S. military presence. Remember, the shipping industry answers to insurance underwriters, not to CENTCOM. Maritime risk firm Ambry's Joshua Hutchinson warned that merchant shipping is advised to reconsider Strait of Hormuz transits, noting that Iran maintains control over the strait and is showcasing intent and capability to act against civilian shipping. If enough tanker operators decide the risk premium is too high, Project Freedom succeeds militarily but fails commercially. That's a win for Iran without firing a single ballistic missile. Option 2, go after the Gulf partners. Today's ADNOC tanker attack was not random. It was a message to every Gulf Cooperation Council member watching this conflict. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, that proximity to American operations makes you a target. Iran has already demonstrated willingness to expand the conflict geographically, with a sea drone striking an oil tanker anchored near Mubarak al-Kabir port in Kuwait, more than 800 kilometers from the strait itself, representing a significant expansion of the conflict's geographic footprint. If Iran starts systematically targeting Gulf state energy infrastructure, oil terminals, LNG, facilities, desalination plants, the economic and political pressure on Washington to negotiate a resolution becomes enormous. It's a brutal calculation, but it's entirely consistent with IRGC doctrine. Option 3, and this is the one that keeps serious analysts awake, the mine threat. U.S. military intelligence confirmed that Iran began planting naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz back in March, with Trump demanding their immediate removal, and the U.S. military reporting it had destroyed 16 Iranian mine layers. But 16 mine layers destroyed does not mean 0 mines in the water. Naval mines are among the most cost-effective weapons in existence, cheap to produce, extraordinarily difficult to find and neutralize, and capable of sinking vessels that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. A single mine strike on a commercial tanker transiting the U.S. protected corridor under Project Freedom would be catastrophic, not just physically, but psychologically. It would signal that the U.S. military cannot guarantee safe passage, even with 15,000 service members and 100 aircraft overhead. That narrative would do more damage to Project Freedom than 100 fast attack boat swarms. Now here's the diplomatic picture, because this is not purely a military confrontation, and anyone telling you it isn't giving you the full story. Diplomatic efforts to end the war were ongoing over the weekend, with the two countries discussing an Iranian peace proposal, even as Trump announced Project Freedom. Iran reportedly submitted a 14-point peace plan, and Trump rejected it. His language was revealing. He said Iran had not paid a big enough price for what they have done over the last 47 years. That is not the language of a president looking for a quick off-ramp. That is a president who believes maximum pressure is working and intends to keep applying it until the terms shift decisively in Washington's favor. Iran's position is that the blockade must be lifted before any new talks can happen. Washington's position is that concessions must come first. Neither side is moving, and both are tightening the vice. That diplomatic deadlock is actually the most dangerous variable in this entire equation. Because when military operations are running hot, diplomatic channels are simultaneously frozen, the margin for miscalculation shrinks to almost nothing. One Iranian missile that actually finds its target. One U.S. strike that kills more IRGC commanders than intended. One Gulf state infrastructure attack that crosses a red line nobody publicly announced. Any one of those scenarios can transform a controlled pressure campaign into something much harder to contain. There's also the broader coalition picture to consider, and this one genuinely frustrates me every time I dig into it. A third aircraft carrier, along with thousands of Marines and paratroopers, are expected to arrive in the region later this month. The U.S. is not drawing down, it is reinforcing. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, you have European governments that have been floating alternative multinational missions as a way of appearing engaged without directly backing the American blockade. The UK, France, and Germany have all been uncomfortable with the pace and scope of the US approach. And it's worth being honest about why, because it's not purely principled disagreement about international law or diplomatic process. The reality is that for years, significant financial interests in London were built around the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude futures, pricing mechanisms that generated enormous arbitrage value for City of London Financial. Institutions, every time a barrel of Gulf oil moved through the choke point, those financial interests don't disappear overnight just because there's a war on. They translate into political pressure on governments, quiet conversations in Whitehall about not burning bridges with Tehran, about keeping diplomatic options open, about not getting too far, ahead of where public opinion might be 6 months from now if this conflict drags on. It's uncomfortable to say, but it's the reality of how energy geopolitics intersects with foreign policy at the highest levels. And Iran knows this. Tehran has been extraordinarily sophisticated about identifying and exploiting exactly these fault lines within the Western coalition, using energy leverage, using proxy diplomatic channels through countries like Pakistan and Oman, using their media apparatus to amplify any narrative that suggests American overreach or European discomfort. Diplomacy is running through back channels, with Pakistan serving as one of the intermediary conduits between Washington and Tehran. That back channel matters. It means both sides, despite the missiles and the Apache strikes and the propaganda, have not completely closed the door on a negotiated resolution. And that is actually, quietly, carefully, the most important thing to hold on to as you assess where this goes. So what does the realistic best-case scenario look like for the next 30 days? Project Freedom continues to operate. More merchant vessels transit the corridor. Iran's harassment operations impose costs, but fail to stop the flow. Economic pressure from the dual blockade, American pressure on Iranian ports, Iranian pressure on Gulf shipping, forces both sides toward a framework that allows some face-saving off-ramp. The back channel through Pakistan produces something, not a final deal, not normalization, but a temporary arrangement that gets oil moving, gets gas prices below $4, and gives both Washington and Tehran enough breathing room to negotiate something more durable. And the worst-case scenario? Iran activates a mine that takes out a commercial vessel. The U.S. responds with strikes on Jask Naval Base. Iran launches a mass salvo attack on Gulf energy infrastructure. A third aircraft carrier, along with additional Marine and Army assets arriving later this month, means the U.S. military will have its largest regional presence in over 2 decades. And at some point, that presence exists not just to deter, but to execute. The window between deterrence and kinetic escalation is narrow, and today it got narrower. Here's what I'll leave you with. Today, May 4th, 2026, Iran fired missiles at a U.S. warship in the Strait of Hormuz. The warship wasn't hit. Iran said it was. 6 Iranian fast attack boats were destroyed by American Apache helicopters. 2 U.S. merchant ships made it through the strait. An ADNOC tanker was attacked. Oil hit $4.46 a gallon and climbing. And the USS Abraham Lincoln is still out there right now, launching aircraft into the night.